Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about muscle tissue in the human body. So muscle tissue is obviously specialized for contraction. And the muscle tissue in your body is going to be responsible for all the movements of your body. And this includes not only moving your body around, but also doing things like moving your blood and moving food through your intestines. There's three types of muscle tissue we're going to find in the human body. Cardiac muscle tissue, which is in the heart and is responsible for moving your blood. Skeletal muscle tissue, which tends to be attached to your bones and is from moving your skeleton, doing large body movements. And then smooth muscle tissue, which is the least well known of the three. Smooth muscle tissue tends to be found in the walls of hollow organs, such as your stomach, your intestines, your esophagus, your blood vessels. And it has various functions, like it depends on where we find it, like in the stomach. Smooth muscle tissue is going to be used for churning your food. In the intestines, the smooth muscle is used for moving food through the intestines. Now, when we look at the three types of muscle tissue, I want you to check for these three characteristics. Number one, is it striated or non-striated? Do you see stripes or not? Some muscle tissue is striated, and this is due to highly organized contractible protein fibers found in the muscle tissue. There's so much protein in this tissue, and it is so organized, you can see it in these banded or striped appearances. I want you to check and see whether or not the cells are multinucleated or have a single nucleus per cell. And then I want you to know whether or not the tissue is voluntary or involuntary. Can it be consciously controlled, or is it something that happens at the subconscious level? So first up is skeletal muscle tissue. Down at the bottom here, we see both an artist rendition of a histological slide of skeletal muscle tissue, and then we see an actual photomicrograph. Now, skeletal muscle tissue contains cells called skeletal muscle fibers. So these are long, thin cells, and these cells are as long as the muscle is. So some of these cells are very, very, very long, and they can be over a foot long in some cases. When we look at a histological slide of skeletal muscle tissue, we obviously can't see the whole entire muscle fiber because it's very long and we're just looking at a teeny tiny little part of the skeletal muscle tissue. So oftentimes when you look at a histological slide of skeletal muscle tissue, you might only see, 5, 6 parts of a skeletal muscle fiber. Now, taking a look at the pictures down here, do you see what looks like striations, that banded appearance? So in both these pictures, the skeletal muscle fiber, the cell itself, is running horizontally. Okay? And these striations are running the opposite way. They're going vertically. You can see those stripes in there. So it is a striated tissue. Now we have to check to see whether or not these cells are multinucleated. Right? And if you look at the artist rendition, that one will be very helpful. In the artist rendition here, we see 3 muscle fibers. The top one has 2 nuclei, the middle one has 2 nuclei, and the bottom one has 1. Now, we're only looking at a small part of each muscle fiber here. So indeed, these muscle fibers are multinucleated. And the reason why they're multinucleated is because the way these mature fibers form is during development, we have these immature muscle cells. So you have one muscle cell and another muscle cell. And those 2 muscle cells fuse together to become one cell. And they retain their original nuclei. So now you have one cell with 2 nuclei. Along comes another cell, fuses with that one. And now you have one big cell that was 3 cells. And we're retaining the 3 original nuclei. And this keeps happening over and over and over again until you get a really long muscle fiber. So it is indeed multinucleated. Now, is this tissue voluntary or involuntary? Do you consciously control the major movements of your body? Yes, so skeletal muscle is voluntary. Obviously, some parts of it are going to be involuntary, such as reflexes, but overall it's a voluntary tissue. Next up is cardiac muscle tissue. And again, in the pictures here, we see both an artist's rendition of cardiac muscle tissue, and then we see an actual histological photomicrograph of the tissue. So the cardiac muscle cells, also called cardiocytes or myocardial cells, make up the bulk of this tissue. And in both these pictures, the cardiac muscle cells are running horizontally. And if you look closely, you can see bands running vertically. So it is a striated tissue. It does have that highly organized protein fiber component to it. Now, the cells here aren't long and thin like with the muscle fibers. Instead, the cells are kind of branchy, but each cardiac muscle cell is attached to its neighboring cell. And the attachment sites are very important. The attachment sites between two cardiac muscle cells are called intercalated discs. And they are physiologically significant because they're not just a bunch of glue keeping these two cells together. There actually are tiny little canals within the intercalated discs that allow one cell to share things with its neighbor. So the cytoplasm of one cell is continuous with the cytoplasm of the neighboring cell. And all cardiac muscle cells are connected to each other through these intercalated discs. And the intercalated discs can often be seen on histological slides as denoted by the black arrows here. You can see the darker staining bands are the intercalated discs. It's kind of hard to tell, but cardiac muscle cells have a single nucleus per cell. And this tissue is involuntary. Try as you might, you cannot consciously control your contractions of your cardiac muscle tissue. Yeah, you can make yourself get really mad and make your heart rate go up, but that's not the same thing. Last, we have smooth muscle tissue. And again, we have an artist rendition and an actual histological slide of the smooth muscle tissue. It's rather nondescript compared to the other muscle tissues. It's definitely lacking the striations. We don't see those little stripes like we were seeing. This is a non-striated tissue. The cells here are just called smooth muscle cells, and they are shaped like a spindle, which means they're thinner on the ends and they get sort of thicker in the middle, kind of like a worm shape almost. It's a single nucleus per cell, so it's not a multinucleated tissue. We're going to find smooth muscle tissue in the walls of tube-like organs, such as like the ureters, the esophagus, and the stomach. And depending upon the location, it has a different function, but generally the muscle tissue there is used to propel something through the tube. It's a little bit different when we find the smooth muscle tissue in the walls of our blood vessels. In that case, the smooth muscle is not propelling your blood through your blood vessel. Instead, we can dilate or constrict our blood vessels in order to do things like regulate blood pressure and regulate blood flow to different organs.